Andrey Vlasov was a lieutenant general of the Soviet Union's Red Army. During the Second World War, he was given command of entire armies tasked with the defense of Moscow and with the organization of the relief of Leningrad. But it was during his attempts to relieve the siege that the Germans encircled and captured him and his army. Now, this man was a Soviet hero general, which makes what followed all the more surprising. Because before too long, Vlasov openly collaborated with Nazi Germany, established a so-called Russian Liberation Army, and managed to convert a dozen other Soviet generals and thousands of former Red Army soldiers to defect and side themselves on the German side. These men now took up arms against the Red Army, which they had been commanding and serving in not too long before. The entire existence of the Russian Liberation Army and Vlasov as the embodiment of a disillusioned, bitter Soviet general speak to the imagination. Still, their stories have been snowed under by the magnitude of the Second World War. Although Vlasov didn't rise to infamy until halfway through the Second World War, he saw quite a number of turbulent changes during his lifetime. He was born as Andrey Andreyevich Vlasov, the youngest of 13 children in September 1900, to a farmer's family in the village of Lomakino. Although born in a serf family, Vlasov's father did all he could to ensure his children received an education. He managed to send off the oldest son, Ivan, to school, but his education depleted the family's income. The only reason Vlasov was able to attend school and later a theological seminary was because his older brother paid for it. As a teenager, he himself taught local children to earn a modest income and support himself in his studies. He graduated from the local theological school, continuing his studies by enrolling in the agricultural school of Nizhny Novgorod. Until he was 17, the Tsar was still in power, but the February Revolution toppled him. Later that year, the Bolshevik Revolution launched the former empire into a state of gruesome civil war. Bolsheviks were still consolidating their power, and war communism and every aspect of life was dedicated to achieving victory. The Bolsheviks were fighting battles on multiple fronts, with Admiral Kolchak in the east, Yudenich in the Baltics, and Wrangel and Denikin in the southwest, all trying to defeat the communists. Territory under Bolshevik occupation was in a dire situation, with widespread famine and droughts trying to replenish the ever-thinning ranks of the Red Army. In spring 1919, Vlasov was drafted into the 27th Infantry Volga Regiment. He quit his studies and took up arms against the White Forces. Showing a talent for strategy and organizational capabilities, the Red Army sent him off to the officer school. By late summer that year, Vlasov already sported the rank of lieutenant, commanding the 2nd Don Division in Crimea against Denikin's White Army. He distinguished himself in several battles fought in the south. Denikin's White Army suffered 2 defeats at Orel and Voronezh in late 1919, with Vlasov chasing. Contemporary reports note that Vlasov's unit was among the most exemplary ones. When in 1920 the Bolsheviks more or less cleared the region from the White Army, Vlasov's Don Division was sent to the Caucasus to take up arms against the Black Baron, Pyotr Wrangel. He was preparing an offensive. Vlasov reached the rank of company commander, and after a few months he was sent to the division's headquarters as deputy chief of staff. The last action Vlasov saw during the Civil War was against the Ukrainian anarchist Nestor Makhno. By the time the Civil War ended, he was a captain looking forward at a successful career path within the Red Army. Perhaps surprising though, he didn't actually join the Communist Party until 1930. At the time of the Civil War, Vlasov firmly believed the Bolsheviks were bringing prosperity to Russia. Sources indicate news of the Kronstadt rebellion did reach him, as did the terror of the secret police, the Cheka. Still, according to him, all these events could be justified by the fact they were building a new world, and people first had to suffer before real communism could take shape. When in 1921 the Civil War died down, the Red Army was significantly reduced in size. Still, Vlasov managed to remain in service and steadily rise through the ranks. Earning rapid promotions, his men became some of the most excellent of the Soviet Union's Red Army. Sources survive stating Red Army's Chief of Staff, Pavel Lebedev, was very impressed by the superb training Vlasov's men received. Vlasov kept rising through the ranks, commanding regimental schools, becoming a battalion commander by the late 1920s. By 1930, he became the tactical instructor of the Leningrad School for the Red Army officers. Around this time, he formally joined the Communist Party as well, and he received postings at multiple advanced military schools. In 1937, the Second Sino-Japanese War broke out. The Soviet Union's military advisor to China's Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek was General Cherepanov. 1 year after the outbreak of war, Vlasov was dispatched to China as Cherepanov's chief of staff. Vlasov lectured senior Chinese officers on operational tactics before being assigned as military advisor to General Yang Qishang. It was Vlasov who had to convince the old warlord, who held 2 northern Chinese provinces, to send his troops to Chiang's aid against the Japanese. After 4 months, Yan finally gave in and joined the fight. Coincidentally, around that time, Cherepanov was recalled to Moscow, and Vlasov now took over his role as military advisor to Chiang. In the background, other developments took place, and Vlasov's posting in China has to be seen in a broader context, because it became his blessing. Stalin's Great Purge reached its height in the late 1930s. The purge saw an enormous number of Vlasov's colleagues and superiors arrested, interned, and executed. Yet Vlasov survived the purge unscathed, which says quite a bit because there weren't many men of his rank to survive it. To put things into perspective, the purge eliminated 3 of the 5 marshals, 13 of the 15 army commanders, 8 of the 9 admirals, and 154 of 186 division commanders. You could say the Red Army was decapitated at a crucial time in history, as Europe was on the brink of the outbreak of the Second World War. But Vlasov escaped the terror. In late 1939, he was replaced by General Kuzmin Kachanov. He returned to Moscow and received the Golden Order of the Dragon for his efforts in improving Soviet-Chinese relations. He was also promoted to division commander and major general. Understanding war was coming closer, he devoted day and night to increase the organization of Red Army's training facilities. By December, he was sent into the field stationed at Peremyshl, a frontier area of the Soviet Union. Commanding the multi-ethnic 99th Infantry Division, Vlasov was fully aware of the Red Army units' often poor conditions. The enormous losses during the Winter War against Finland made that all too clear. When in fall 1940 the Red Army Command made a list of the best Red Army divisions, Vlasov's ranked the first in the Kiev military district. According to Soviet Marshal Semyon Timoshenko, it was the best division of the entire Red Army. Vlasov's division earned the banner for Best Artillery Regiment, banner for the Best Infantry Regiment, and the banner for the Best Division as a whole. Timoshenko awarded Vlasov an inscribed gold watch, and Stalin awarded him with the Order of Lenin. Later that year, Moscow called on Vlasov to aid Commander-in-Chief Kirill Meretskov in organizing the entire Red Army's training instructions. Vlasov was one of the men critical in the Red Army's infrastructure, recognized for his expertise, lauded by friends and revered by foes. Against this backdrop, Germany was planning its invasion of the Soviet Union, which would eventually lead to Vlasov turning his back on everything he had worked to build up his entire life. So, what were the events that led him to take such drastic action? In January 1941, Vlasov received command of the 4th Mechanized Corps, stationed in Lvov. His tank corps consisted of approximately 28,000 soldiers and nearly 1,000 tanks, although the Soviet Union lagged behind in a war that would largely revolve around mechanized warfare. The Germans launched Operation Barbarossa in June that year. Vlasov was sent to Kiev to stop the rapidly advancing Germans, but the Red Army was no match for the better-equipped invaders. Within the first few days, it became painfully obvious the Red Army was entirely unprepared. Vlasov's men saw combat in western Ukraine, but General Kirponos took 1.5 divisions to organize a counterattack from the south. To no avail, and all tanks ran aground in a swamp near Uman, where the Wehrmacht encircled and annihilated them. Vlasov barely managed to escape with his army, breaking out of a near encirclement. 1 month after the Germans launched Operation Barbarossa, Vlasov had already fought 20 battles with his badly beaten division. Due to fuel and spare parts shortage, many tanks were left behind. On July 17, Vlasov was ordered to return to Kiev and defend the city. He did so until September, albeit under horrible circumstances, ending in encirclement once again. In late September, he was allowed to retreat by Stalin. His division now had to fight for 550 kilometers all the way to the east, realizing in what a disorganized state the Red Army was. There was a shortage of virtually everything, and a man's life was worth nothing. It must have been around this time that Vlasov began forming the opinion that the Bolsheviks, embodied by Stalin, were responsible for this horrible situation. In November 1941, he arrived in Moscow, where the Soviet High Command assigned him to prepare the city's defense. Still, Moscow was in a deplorable state. Schoolboys and the elderly were ordered to dig anti-tank ditches, weaponry and ammunition were scarce, food even scarcer. Vlasov tried his best to organize the 20th Army to defend Moscow. Surprisingly, he was successful and managed to push back the Germans to Rzhev. For his successful defense, he was promoted to lieutenant general and received the Order of the Red Banner. 3 months later, Vlasov was sent up north. Stalin directly ordered him to command the Second Shock Army and break the siege of Leningrad. Unfortunately for him, the Germans had enough supplies at that point to withstand his attack. After a battle with incredibly heavy losses, the Germans encircled Vlasov's army group in the swamp southeast of Leningrad. He now put everything on everything to ensure his army was liberated. He took an aeroplane and flew to the surrounding troops and tried to have them rescue his men. When the army of a fellow general managed to create a 3-kilometer corridor, other surrounding armies did not come to the rescue. Vlasov flew back to his army, and although he was ordered to leave them behind and fly back to Moscow, he remained. He decided to stay with his men and be captured, whatever may happen to him. It was July 1942 when the Germans captured Vlasov. The lieutenant general, once lauded by all those of the Red Army, was completely disillusioned. His superiors were willing to have all his men perish, as the official order was not to get captured. The Germans transported Vlasov to Vinnytsia, a city in west-central Ukraine that doubled as a POW camp. In his captivity between the interrogations, Vlasov had plenty of time to think over the wrongs of the communists and how things had gotten this bad. Together with fellow-minded disillusioned officers, Vlasov wrote a pamphlet to the German High Command in an attempt to develop an army composed of Russian patriots fighting Stalin's communism. This proposal was rejected initially, mainly because Hitler feared a patriotic Russian political movement would ruin his plans for the colonization of the East in case of a German victory. Although faced with rejection, the letter led to Vlasov gaining contact with former Tsarist and White Army officers fighting on the German side. These Russian officers fighting on Germany's side, responsible for anti-communist propaganda, pamphlets dropped behind front lines, now arranged for Vlasov to be flown to Berlin. Here, he was put at the head of a group of defected Soviet officers and tasked with establishing the Russian Liberation Movement. The Russian Liberation Army, abbreviated as ROA, eventually became its military arm. In January 1943, Vlasov wrote a pamphlet calling on all Russian soldiers to rise up against Stalin's criminal regime. The Germans would liberate Russia from the communist scourge. This pamphlet became known as the Smolensk Proclamation. Vlasov outlined several points in the pamphlet, giving us a clear view of where his disillusionment with the Soviet system and especially Stalin's regime stemmed from. To begin with, Vlasov promised the abolition of forced labor and the guarantee that work leads to material welfare. Secondly, the collective farms should be abolished and land should be transferred into private peasant property. Thirdly, trade, handcrafts, artisan trades, and private initiative to participate in economic life should be re-established. Fourthly, intelligentsia should not be censored by the state anymore. Social justice and the protection of the working people from exploitation should be guaranteed. Working people should receive proper education and secure retirements and the right to leisure. There are many more points, such as the reign of terror and violence should be terminated immediately, with Vlasov most likely referring to the Great Purge preceding the outbreak of the Second World War. Actual freedom of religion, conscience, speech, assembly, and personal residence should be guaranteed. Political prisoners of Bolshevism should be liberated. One of the last points he makes is that freedom should be ensured for ethnic minorities in the Soviet Union, often suffering under the dominant Russian ethnic group. But the list goes on and on. Luftwaffe bombers dropped the pamphlets behind enemy lines. Still, historians agree Vlasov's call to action didn't have any notable success. This also had to do with the morale boost the Red Army received after their victory at Stalingrad. But for Russians already fighting on the German side, the pamphlet was an incredible morale boost. They were recognized for their efforts to fight communism, received their own insignia, and even a newspaper named The Volunteer. In this newspaper, Vlasov published an open letter titled "Why Have I Taken Up the Struggle Against Bolshevism?" Vlasov traveled through Germany and occupied territories, attempting to gain support for his movement. The Soviet response was rather mild. Initially, they ignored Vlasov's desertion altogether, and when the pamphlets became too many to ignore, they tried to have him assassinated. However, When this failed, it already was clear Germany was on the back foot, and aside from hit pieces, the Soviets didn't really have anything to do. Vlasov was fighting a losing battle anyway. Vlasov's ambitions under the Germans weren't realized as well, not even close. The few commanders of the ROA who survived the war by being fortunate enough not to end up in Soviet captivity later noted how the Germans promised to supply more Soviet POWs than the ROA ever received. Their equipment was subpar as well. Although Vlasov's army was autonomous in theory, in reality it was obviously heavily monitored by the Gestapo, by the SS, and by the regular German army. As such, when Vlasov began emerging as a potential future Russian head of state by swaying the masses in Russian-occupied territories, the High Command took control. They immediately forbade him to make any political statements in public whatsoever. After the failed Battle of Kursk, most Russian troops fighting in eastern battalions were sent to the western and southern fronts anyway, as the Germans suspected foul play. After the failed assassination attempt on Hitler by Klaus von Stauffenberg, Heinrich Himmler understood the precarious situation Germany found itself in. He organized a meeting with Vlasov in September and agreed to aid him in equipping and organizing an army consisting of Russian nationals. Up until that point, Russian volunteers hadn't really been centralized under Vlasov's control, but instead fought in eastern battalions, Ostbataillone. Subsequently, Vlasov issued the so-called Prague Manifesto, issued in November 1944. This four-point manifesto encompassed the entire ideology behind Vlasov's reason to defect and the aims he had for the ROA. In short, their aim was to overthrow the Stalin tyranny, return to the liberties of February 1917, People's Revolution, which is before the actual Bolshevik Revolution, to sue for peace with Germany immediately, and to create a Russian state not governed by communists and exploiters. Vlasov supposedly refused to entertain anti-Semitic passages. It is worth examining what the ROA ended up consisting of. Ironically, but logically, it reached its peak in late 1944 when it became clear Germany lost the war. Vlasov commanded 30 poorly equipped divisions of Soviet defectors and forced laborers. According to a contemporary pamphlet written by a Russian journalist in exile, Vlasov commanded up to 500,000 soldiers. Approximately 50,000 of these men were operational and directly under Vlasov's command, yet they only saw one significant battle at Erlenhof near the Oder River in April 1945. Vlasov ordered his men to try and concentrate their forces in Bohemia in the hopes they would be able to either trek westward and surrender to the Allies or trek southward and join the Serbian Chetniks in the Balkan. By April 1945, it was clear to the vast majority of people fighting on Germany's side that they lost the war. Vlasov too realized this, and he realized the horrible fate that awaited him if the Soviets would recapture him. In the hopes Western powers would not extradite him to the Soviets, he ordered the Russian Liberation Army to support the Prague uprising. There had been insurgents rising up against the Germans in May 1945. The ROA subsequently trekked westward, but none of this mattered. Most of the ROA were arrested by Soviet forces near the city of Pilsen. Others who managed to reach the American front lines were extradited regardless. The only men who escaped extradition and survived were 8,000-odd soldiers who were fortunate enough to surrender to George Patton. The American general refused to extradite any POWs to the Soviets, which became their lifesaver, literally. Vlasov was captured by a Soviet captain not much later. The Soviets put him under 24/7 surveillance because it was deemed likely for him to take his own life. He arrived in the Lubyanka prison in Moscow, where he was interrogated and severely tortured for over a year. It wasn't until the summer of 1946 that he was convicted of high treason and executed after a brief show trial. All members of the ROA in Soviet captivity were executed. Vlasov remains a lesser-known figure of the Second World War, even though his story is quite an exceptional one. One of the very few reminders of him is a controversial monument close by New York. In 1967, a Russian Orthodox abbey revealed the memorial dedicated to him and the Russian Liberation Army. Thank you for watching this video. If there's a topic or event you would like to know more about, let me know your thoughts in a comment. I would also really like to thank all my patrons and channel members for their generous support. If you enjoy House of History and want to support my work, consider joining me on Patreon. For just $1 a month, you already get access to the exclusive Patreon series. Don't forget to subscribe. See you next time.